Tonight, we wander into the hushed corridors of medieval castles, where behind heavy stone walls and flickering torchlight, kings and queens whispered secrets of forbidden love. Before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these bedtime journeys. Let me know in the comments what time you rewatching and from where it is. Always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world. For the best experience, dim your lights, let the gentle hum of a fan soothe you, and let's step quietly into history together. Close your eyes for a second and picture this: a massive stone castle with thick walls that smell a little like damp earth and smoke from torches. It's night. The great hall is quiet. The musicians have gone. The servants are asleep. Somewhere up a spiral staircase, a king or queen lies awake in their chamber, not thinking about running the kingdom, not worrying about taxes or armies, but thinking about something much more dangerous: love. And not just any love, a forbidden one. You see, for kings and queens in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about romance. It was on tea about butterflies in your stomach, or writing someone's initials in the margins of your diary. Actually, diaries weren't even common then, but you get the point. Royal marriages were basically contracts. They were giant political deals, meant to tie to families or to countries together. Love didn't really enter the equation. Take a typical medieval king. He didn't sit around swiping left or right. He didn't pick a partner because she made him laugh or liked the same music. Instead, he married the daughter of some duke or foreign ruler because it secured land, wealth, or peace. The queen, well, she often had even less of a say. Sometimes she was sent off as a teenager to marry a man twice her age, just because it suited the politics of the moment. So what happens when the royal couple doesn't feel any spark? Or worse, when they don't even like each other? That's when the dangerous game of secret love affairs began. For many kings and queens, love affairs were a way to escape duty. Imagine being stuck in a loveless marriage where every move you make is watched by courtiers, where you can't sneeze without someone reporting it to the king's advisors. The only place you might feel like a real person, not just a crown with a body attached, is in the arms of someone forbidden. But of course, sneaking around wasn't simple. Royals lived under constant watch. They had servants dressing them, tasting their food, guarding their rooms. Privacy was almost non-existent. If you wanted to sneak in a lover, it required strategy, trust, and sometimes a whole network of people willing to cover for you. And if you got caught, well, let's just say it didn't end in a cute oops moment. The risks were enormous. Scandal could destroy reputations. Betrayal could lead to exile. In some cases, it could even mean death. Love, for a medieval monarch, was never just personal, it was political dynamite. But that's also why the allure was so strong. The very danger made it more exciting. Think about it. For a king who had armies at his command, or a queen who had crowns and jewels at her fingertips, what was left that could give them a real thrill? Secret romance was like a forbidden fire in an otherwise controlled life. Of course, not every affair was about passion. Sometimes it was about power. If a queen chose a lover, it could be someone who helped her influence politics behind the scenes. If a king chose a mistress, it could be someone who gave him an edge over rivals in the court. But often, these relationships mixed desire with ambition, and that's when things got really messy. Picture a royal banquet. Everyone's laughing, goblets of wine are clinking, music is playing. The king is at the high table with his queen, but across the hall, he keeps stealing glances at a certain lady in waiting. Nobody else notices, or maybe they pretend not to, but the queen sees, and she files it away. That one look, held for a second too long, could ripple through the entire court like a stone dropped into water. These courts were buzzing hives of gossip. Servants whispered in kitchens, knights shared rumors in the training yard, and chroniclers scribbled their observations in books. A single rumor could catch fire. And remember, reputations back then were fragile. If a queen was suspected of infidelity, her honor was questioned, and by extension, the legitimacy of her children. That was no small thing, because a kingdom could literally fall apart if people believed the heir to the throne was truly royal blood. For kings, the stakes were different, but just as high. A king's mistress could become powerful enough to influence state decisions. Some mistresses received lands, titles, or gifts that enraged the nobility. Others simply drew jealousy. Either way, affairs didn't stay secret forever. They had consequences that shaped politics and history. But let's not forget, beyond the politics and power plays, these were still people, human beings with the same desires and flaws as anyone else. Imagine being married to someone you don't love. Maybe someone who barely speaks your language. Maybe someone who sees you only as a tool for producing heirs. It's not so surprising that even kings and queens looked elsewhere for connection. And there's something oddly comforting about that, right? Even the people who wore crowns and commanded nations still longed for romance. They still wrote love letters, exchanged secret tokens, or risked everything for a midnight rendezvous. It reminds us that beneath all the pomp and ceremony, they were just human. Of course, the difference is that their love lives could shake entire kingdoms. A secret kiss in a garden wasn't just romantic, it could spark wars, rebellions, or dynastic collapse. That's the weight they carried. So as we start this journey into the secret love affairs of medieval kings and queens, remember this: these weren't just juicy scandals for the medieval version of tabloid. They were dangerous games of love, where the stakes were life, death, and crowns. And maybe, as you're getting cozy now, tucked under your blanket, you can picture it: the soft glow of torches on stone walls, the quiet hush of a sleeping castle, and somewhere inside, a king or queen lying awake, heart racing, wondering if tonight is the night they'll take the risk and follow their heart instead of their crown. If we're talking about secret love affairs and bold queens, there's really no better place to start than with Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was one of the most remarkable women of the entire Middle Ages, Queen of France, then Queen of England, and mother to kings who would change history. Eleanor lived a life so big, so dramatic, that people are still telling stories about her 900 years later. Now, Eleanor wasn't just a queen who sat quietly in her castle. She was fiery, clever, and honestly, a little dangerous to the men who underestimated her. She had power, charm, and let's be real, Hera, bit of a reputation for loving boldly, and that reputation still follows her. Let's start at the beginning. Eleanor was born around 1122 in southern France, in a place called Aquitaine. And Aquitaine wasn't some boring farmland. It was one of the richest and most cultured regions of Europe. Her family spoke a local language called Occitan. They had poets called troubadours, wandering the courts, singing about love and passion. And they had this whole courtly love culture that basically glorified romance. In other words, Eleanor grew up in an atmosphere where love wasn't just about politics. It was celebrated in poems, songs, and stories that shaped her big time. When she was a teenager, Eleanor married Louis VII of France. That made her Queen of France. Pretty good start, right? But the marriage? Oh boy. Let's just say Eleanor and Louis were not a match made in heaven. He was deeply religious, serious, a little stiff. Eleanor, on the other hand, was vibrant, witty, and loved excitement. Some chroniclers even hinted she teased him about being boring. Imagine being king of France, and your teenage wife is like, you're kind of a snooze. Their marriage limped along for a while, but the spark just wasn't there. The gossip mill cranked up, as it always does. Rumors spread that Eleanor might have been a little too friendly with other men. One story even suggested she had a fling with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, while she and Louis were on the Second Crusade. Now, we can't know if that's true, but the fact that people believed it tells you how she was seen: bold, flirtatious, and not afraid to push boundaries. Eventually, her marriage to Louis collapsed. Officially, it was annulled in 1152 because they were too closely related by church law. But let's be honest. But here's the kicker. Barely weeks after the annulment, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become King Henry II of England. Talk about a power move. She went from being Queen of France to Queen of England in the space of 2 months. If there had been medieval tabloids, Eleanor would have been splashed across every cover. Her marriage to Henry was passionate, but also explosive. They had 8 children together, including Richard the Lionheart and King John. So, clearly, there was chemistry. But Henry was not exactly a one-woman man. He had plenty of affairs, and Eleanor wasn't shy about letting him know she was unhappy. Now, did Eleanor herself have secret affairs? This is where history gets spicy. Chroniclers, at the time most of them men, by the way, loved to paint Eleanor as dangerously seductive. They claimed she had lovers among troubadours, that she encouraged knights to adore her, and that she basically ran her court like a romance festival. Some even said she had too much influence over men. One popular rumor was about Eleanor and a troubadour named Bernard de Ventadorn. He was famous for writing passionate songs about unattainable ladies. And wouldn't you know it, a lot of his poems sound like they might have been inspired by Eleanor. Did she actually have a relationship with him? Nobody knows. But just the suspicion shows how people saw her as a queen who could inspire deep, possibly dangerous love. What we do know is that Eleanor wasn't afraid to use her boldness in politics, too. At one point, she actually supported her sons in rebelling against her husband, King Henry. That's right, she helped organize a revolt against her own husband, partly because she was fed up with his controlling ways, and, some suggest, because she had found companionship with other men in court. The rebellion failed, and Henry locked her up for years, but that didn't stop her legacy from growing. Even in later life, Eleanor remained influential. She arranged marriages for her children, advised kings, and continued to be seen as this larger-than-life figure. And through it all, the rumors of her love life never quite disappeared. People couldn't stop speculating about who she might have loved, who she might have inspired, and how far she was willing to go to follow her heart. Eleanor's story is important because it shows us how dangerous it could be for a queen to step outside the lines. A king could have mistresses, and everyone might grumble, but it was usually tolerated. A queen, if she even looked like she might have a lover, it could destroy her reputation and put her life at risk. Eleanor, however, seemed to thrive in that dangerous space. She lived boldly, and she loved boldly, whether the stories were true or exaggerated. And maybe that's why her legend still feels alive today. She wasn't just another queen who played her role quietly. She lived with fire, she inspired poetry, and she challenged the men around her. Even if the rumors of her affairs were just rumors, they tell us something about how people saw her as a woman too powerful, too independent, and maybe too fascinating to be contained by just one king. So, as you lie here listening, imagine Eleanor in her grand halls in Aquitaine, music floating in the air, poets reciting verses, knights watching her with admiration. She was more than a queen. She was a symbol of love and power colliding. A woman whose heart weather whispered about in truth or rumor shaped the history of Europe. And as the candles burned low in her castles, and the world whispered about her secret loves, Eleanor of Aquitaine became exactly what the title of this chapter says, a queen who loved too boldly. Now, if Eleanor of Aquitaine was the queen who loved too boldly, then Edward II of England was the king who loved a little, controversially. His story isn't just about romance, it's about friendship, favoritism, scandal, and a relationship that shook the English throne to its foundations. Edward II ruled England in the early 1300s, and he wasn't exactly what people wanted in a medieval king. He wasn't a warrior like his father, Edward I, who was called Longshanks and spent most of his reign fighting wars. Edward II was different. He loved music, theater, hanging out with ordinary people, and most importantly, he loved one man above all others, Piers Gaveston. Who was Gaveston? He wasn't a prince or a duke. He wasn't from a powerful royal family. He was just a knight from Gascony, which was part of Edward's domains in France. But Edward adored him. He made Gaveston the center of his world. When Edward's father was alive, he noticed how attached his son was to this young knight, and he wasn't thrilled about it. Edward I actually banished Gaveston at one point, hoping to break the bond. But when Edward II became king in 1307, the first thing he did was bring Gaveston back. Not just bring him back, either. He showered him with titles, lands, and wealth. He made him the Earl of Cornwall, which was one of the richest titles in the kingdom. Now, you can imagine how the nobles felt about this. Here was this outsider, this flashy young knight, suddenly richer and more powerful than most of them, all because the king couldn't get enough of him. The nobles were furious. They saw Gaveston as arrogant, greedy, and way too close to Edward. And of course, the gossip machine went into overdrive. People whispered that Edward and Gaveston were more than just friends. Were they lovers? The truth is, we'll never know for sure. Some historians think their relationship was romantic. Others say it was a deep friendship that looked suspicious in a time when men showing affection to each other was frowned upon at court. But here's the thing. Whatever the exact nature of their bond, Edward's obsession with Gaveston was undeniable. He called him his brother and his beloved. He gave him jewels and extravagant gifts. He relied on him for advice more than he relied on the nobility. It was like Gaveston was the king behind the throne, and that didn't sit well with the rest of the kingdom. The nobles tried again and again to separate them. They pressured Edward to send Gaveston away. Sometimes Edward gave in, only to sneak Gaveston back later. It was like one of those toxic relationships where your friends say, "This person is no good for you," but you just can't let go. The tension got worse and worse until it exploded. In 1312, a group of angry barons captured Gaveston. They didn't just exile him this time, they executed him brutally. They cut off his head and left his body on the hillside. When Edward heard the news, he was devastated. Imagine it, the one person he loved, above all others, killed by his own nobles. It broke him, and it also set off years of turmoil in England. Edward never really recovered from losing Gaveston. He continued to rule, but his reign spiraled into conflict, rebellion, and eventually tragedy. And here's where it gets even darker. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, watched all of this unfold. She saw her husband favoring Gaveston, ignoring her, and alienating the nobility. It planted seeds of resentment in her that would later grow into one of the biggest betrayals in English royal history. But that's a story we'll get to in the next chapter. So what do we make of Edward and Gaveston? Were they truly lovers? Or was Gaveston simply the king's closest friend? We can't know for sure, but either way, their relationship was dangerous in the eyes of medieval politics. Kings were supposed to be strong, authoritative, and surrounded by loyal nobles. Edward, instead, poured his heart into one man, and it cost him dearly. There's something strangely human about Edward's story. He wasn't a great king by medieval standards. He wasn't a fearsome warrior or a cunning strategist. But he loved, maybe too openly, maybe too naively. And in the ruthless world of medieval courts, that vulnerability was seen as weakness. Imagine Edward in his chambers, late at night, pacing by the fire, waiting for Gaveston to walk in. Imagine the laughter, the comfort, the easy companionship they shared when the weight of the crown got too heavy. And then imagine the silence after Gaveston was gone, the emptiness in those same chambers, the absence of the one person who made Edward feel like himself. That's the heartbreak at the center of this chapter. Not just politics, not just scandal, but the loneliness of a king who couldn't live without his closest companion. In the end, Edward II's story with Piers Gaveston reminds us that love, in any form, doesn't always fit neatly into history books. Sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's misunderstood, and sometimes it's so powerful that it brings down a kingdom. Let us drift now into the story of one of the most fascinating queens of the Middle Ages, Isabella of France. History gave her a nickname that sounds like it came straight out of a medieval horror tale, the She-Wolf of France. A name like that tells you right away that she was not a woman people forgot. Her life was filled with drama, betrayal, and, yes, a secret love affair that changed the course of English history. But to understand Isabella's story, we first need to rewind to her childhood. She wasn't born in some minor noble house. She was royalty from the start. Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV of France, one of the most powerful kings of his time. Philip was a serious, calculating ruler, the kind of man who could look at you and make you feel like you'd already done something wrong. Growing up in that environment, Isabella learned early how dangerous politics could be and how important appearances were. By the age of 12, Isabella was sent across the Channel to marry Edward II of England. 12 years old, imagine being barely a teenager, leaving behind your home, your family, and everything familiar to marry a man you didn't even know, let alone love. But this was the fate of many princesses in medieval Europe. Royal marriages were political weapons designed to secure alliances and keep peace between kingdoms. So, Isabella became the Queen of England. She probably hoped, as many young brides did, that her husband would at least treat her with kindness. Instead, she found herself in a strange, humiliating position, because Edward II's heart didn't belong to her, belonged to another. That other was Piers Gaveston, Edward's closest companion, and, some believed, his lover. Isabella must have felt invisible, watching her new husband dote on Gaveston, giving him titles, gifts, and even the kind of attention that a wife might expect. At court banquet, Gaveston sat higher than some of the greatest lords of England. To Isabella, barely in her teens, it was a public embarrassment. When Gaveston was executed by angry nobles, Isabella might have thought things would improve. But Edward never became the husband she longed for. He was weak in politics, careless with his duties, and more comfortable with ordinary craftsmen than with nobles or with her. Over the years, Isabella endured neglect and frustration, but she was clever. She watched, she waited, and eventually she acted. Enter Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was everything Edward wasn't. He was confident, commanding, and ambitious. A powerful nobleman with striking presence, Mortimer became the man Isabella turned to, not just for affection, but for partnership. Their relationship began in secret. In a court full of eyes and ears, a queen's affair was one of the most dangerous secrets imaginable. If discovered, it could mean death. But Isabella had grown up in the shadow of King Philip IV. She knew how to keep her cards close. For years, she and Mortimer built a bond. It wasn't just whispers and stolen moments. It was strategy. They both saw that Edward was unfit to rule, and they both hungered for change. And so, their affair turned into a rebellion. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer did the unthinkable. They invaded England together. Picture that: a queen sailing back across the Channel, not to reunite with her husband, but to overthrow him. She brought soldiers, allies, and most importantly, the will to win. The English nobles, already fed up with Edward, quickly joined her cause. The invasion was almost too easy. Edward fled, then was captured. His throne slipped from his hands like sand. Edward was forced to abdicate, to give up his crown to his young son, who became Edward III and Edward II. He was locked away in prison. The following year, he was dead. Officially, it was claimed he died from illness or despair, but rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered he was murdered in a horrific way involving a red-hot poker story, so gruesome that it clings to his legacy centuries later. Whether true or not, it painted Isabella and Mortimer as ruthless conspirators. For a short while, Isabella and Mortimer were unstoppable. She ruled England in her son's name, and Mortimer acted like her king in all but title. Together, they enjoyed power, luxury, and the satisfaction of victory. But power breeds enemies. The same nobles who had once cheered Isabella now grew wary of Mortimer's arrogance. The young Edward III, as he grew older, began to resent the man who had taken his father's place beside his mother. In 1330, the tide turned. Edward III staged a coup, capturing Mortimer and seizing control of his throne. Mortimer was executed, dragged through the streets like a criminal. Isabella, spared her lover's fate, was placed under comfortable house arrest. She spent the rest of her life in relative quiet, away from the spotlight of power she had once seized so boldly. So, what do we make of Isabella's story? Was she a villain, a manipulative queen who betrayed her husband and conspired with her lover to steal a kingdom? Or was she a victim, pushed aside by a neglectful king, forced to find love and respect where she could, and strong enough to fight for her own destiny? The The truth lies somewhere in between. Isabella's love affair with Mortimer was real, but it was also deeply political. It gave her the courage to challenge her husband and the means to change history. Without Mortimer, Isabella might have remained a sidelined queen. With him, she became the chivalfa figure of both fascination and fear. Close your eyes and picture her. Isabella standing on the deck of a ship, the wind whipping her veil as she sails toward England, soldiers waiting at her back, and in her heart the fire of rebellion. Picture the secret glances exchanged with Mortimer, the quiet vows spoken in the shadows, and the dangerous thrill of knowing they were rewriting the fate of a kingdom. It's a story of passion, but also of betrayal. A reminder that love in the medieval world was never just personal. For kings and queens, love could be as sharp as a sword, as heavy as a crown, and as dangerous as war itself. And so, Isabella of France, the Cheval, remains one of the most unforgettable queens of the Middle Ages, not just for the crown she wore, but for the forbidden love that made her powerful and the betrayal that made her infamous. When we think of kings and their love affairs, one name almost always steals the spotlight: Henry VIII of England. If Isabella of France was remembered as the Cheval, then Henry might be remembered as the Lion of Passion. His heart, or maybe his obsession, didn't just shape his personal life, shook the very foundations of religion and politics in Europe. Henry VIII is famous for having 6 wives. You might even know the little rhyme people use to remember their fates: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It sounds like a grim nursery rhyme, but behind it are stories of desire, betrayal, and ambition. And Henry's wives weren't the only ones caught up in his orbit. Mistresses and rumors swirled around his court like a constant storm. Let's start at the beginning. When Henry became king in 1509, he was young, athletic, and dazzling. He played instruments, wrote poetry, and loved jousting. Picture a tall, broad-shouldered man with fiery red hair and the kind of confidence that fills every room. People said he was handsome, charming, and magnetic. In other words, he had options. Henry's first wife was Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Yes, the same Ferdinand and Isabella who funded Columbus's journey. Catherine had been married briefly to Henry's older brother, Arthur, who died young. To keep the alliance between England and Spain strong, she married Henry. For years, they seemed like a solid pair. Catherine was respected, intelligent, and devout. She and Henry even had a daughter, Mary. But here's the problem: no surviving sons. And in Henry's mind, that was a disaster. A king needed a male heir to keep the dynasty strong. Without one, the Tudor line could collapse. Enter Anne Boleyn. Anne. She wasn't Catherine's opposite exactly, but she was everything Catherine wasn't anymore. Young, witty, stylish, and, perhaps most dangerously, unwilling to play the role of mistress. When Henry's eyes landed on Anne, he was smitten. He wrote her love letters, gave her gifts, and begged for her affection. Anne told him no, at least, not as a mistress. She wanted marriage. That's when Henry's personal desire collided with global politics. He asked the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine so he could marry and the Pope refused. Henry wasn't about to take no for an answer. So he broke away from the Catholic Church entirely, creating the Church of England with himself at its head. Just like that, one man's passion tore apart centuries of religious unity. In 1533, Henry married Anne. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of the most powerful monarchs in history. But at the time, Henry was still obsessed with having a son. When Anne suffered miscarriages, Henry's affection cooled. Soon began whispers that Anne was unfaithful. Some accused her of adultery, others of witchcraft, even incest. Whether these accusations were true or not, they gave Henry the excuse he wanted. In 1536, Anne was executed at the Tower of London. It's chilling, isn't it? One day you're the Queen of England, adored by the king, and the next you're facing the executioner's blade. For Henry, passion and cruelty often went hand in hand. After Anne, Henry married Jane Seymour. Unlike Anne, Jane was quiet and gentle. She gave Henry the one thing he craved most, a son, Edward. But her triumph came with tragedy. Jane died shortly after childbirth, leaving Henry heartbroken but satisfied that he finally had an heir. But Henry wasn't the type to stay single for long. His advisors arranged another marriage, this time to Anne of Cleves, a German princess. Henry saw her portrait, liked what he saw, and agreed. But when Anne arrived in person, Henry was not impressed. He supposedly called her a Flanders mare, not exactly a compliment. Their marriage was quickly annulled. Then came Catherine Howard, a teenager, full of energy and charm. Henry was older by now, heavier, and not the dashing figure he once had been. Catherine gave him a taste of youthful excitement again, but she too was accused of adultery, and in 1542 she was executed. Finally, there was Catherine Parr. She was intelligent, steady, and more of a caretaker than a romantic partner. She outlived Henry, earning the last line of that grim rhyme, survived. Now, let's pause for a moment. Beyond the 6 wives, Henry also had mistresses. One of the most notable was Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister. Mary was lively, flirtatious, and, according to rumor, may have even borne Henry children. But in Henry's world, mistresses were fleeting. Wives, on the other hand, carried the weight of politics, religion, and dynasty. What's so fascinating about Henry's love life is that it wasn't just about lust. It was about power. Every time Henry pursued a new love, the entire kingdom shook. His affair with Anne Boleyn didn't just scandalize, it changed the religious map of Europe. His desperation for sons led to executions, divorces, and decades of turmoil. And through it all, the people of England watched, whispered, and feared their king's next move. Picture the scene: Hampton Court Palace, its grand halls lit by flickering torches. Henry sits at the center of a feast, his massive frame dominating the table, jewels glittering on his fingers. Around him, courtiers watch every gesture, every glance. If Henry's eyes lingered on you, it could mean riches beyond imagining, or it could mean your head on the block. That was the danger of love in Henry's court. By the end of his life, Henry was no longer the handsome prince he once was. He was overweight, plagued by health problems, and bitter. But even then, the memory of his passions lingered. His wives, his mistresses, his scandals, they were the stories that defined him. So, what do we learn from Henry VIII's chapter in this tale of secret royal love affairs? We see how one man's heart could alter nations. We see how love and obsession, when tied to a crown, could bring down queens, shatter faiths, and change history forever. Henry may have been a king, but at his core, he was also just a man longing, restless, and often unsatisfied. His loves weren't quiet, tender affairs. They were storms that left whole kingdoms reeling. As you lie here listening, Maybe think about how strange it is that the flutter of one man's heart could ripple across centuries, leaving us still telling his story today. A reminder that kings and queens, for all their crowns and castles, were as vulnerable to desire as anyone else. When you hear the name Catherine the Great, you probably think of palaces, power, and maybe even wild rumors whispered in candlelit corners, and you'd be right. Catherine was one of the most powerful rulers in Russian history, but what people often remember about her are the stories of her lovers, some true, some exaggerated, and some downright slanderous. But Catherine's tale fits perfectly in our journey through the secret love affairs of royalty, because long before her, medieval queens were already facing the same storm of passion, politics, and scandal. Let's set the stage. Catherine wasn't born Russian. She came into the world in 1729 as a minor German princess named Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst. Not exactly a glamorous start, but she was intelligent, curious, and ambitious. When she married the future Peter III of Russia, she took the name Catherine, and eventually, when his short and unpopular reign ended in a coup, she rose to the throne as Empress of Russia. Now, here's the twist. Her marriage to Peter was a disaster. Peter was childish, erratic, and more interested in toy soldiers and silly games than in ruling an empire, in being a good husband. Catherine, meanwhile, was brilliant, disciplined, and hungry for both love and power. Their union was cold, loveless, and doomed from the start. So Catherine did what many queens before her had done in secret. She turned elsewhere for comfort. But unlike most, Catherine didn't just have one lover. Over her long reign, she had several, and many of them played important roles in her court. Some were generals, others were advisors, but they weren't just political allies. They were men Catherine genuinely cared for, trusted, and sometimes loved. The most famous was Gregory Potemkin. Potemkin was more than a lover. He was her partner in every sense. Bold, brilliant, and fiercely loyal, Potemkin helped Catherine expand her empire, modernize Russia, and project her power across Europe. Their love story wasn't just about stolen kisses in secret chambers. It was about building a world together. Even after their romance cooled, Potemkin remained one of her most trusted allies. That's a kind of love most kings and queens could only dream of. But here's where the story gets murky. Catherine's enemies hated her, not just because she was a woman in power, but because she was successful. They couldn't bring her down politically, so they attacked her reputation. Rumors spread that she was insatiable, scandalous, and immoral. Her many lovers were exaggerated into a parade of hundreds. Pamphlets painted her as corrupt and unnatural. And then came the ugliest slander of all, the infamous horse rumor, a disgusting lie invented long after her death with no basis in reality. Why bring this up? Because it shows us something important about queens in history. Kings could have dozens of mistresses and be celebrated for their virility. But queens, a single lover, was enough to brand them dangerous, wicked, or even monstrous. The double standard was sharp, and Catherine, like many before her, bore the brunt of it. Now, let's connect Catherine to her medieval precursors. Think back to Eleanor of Aquitaine, centuries earlier. She too was rumored to have taken lovers, especially among her troubadours and knights. Or Isabella of France, whose affair with Roger Mortimer toppled her husband's throne. Each time, gossip swirled louder because these were women in power. Men's affairs were often tolerated, even encouraged. But women, their passions were turned into weapons against them. Catherine inherited this old tradition of scandal. The difference is, she didn't let it stop her. While medieval queens often had to hide in the shadows, Catherine was unapologetic. She ruled openly, reigned brilliantly, and still had the lovers she wanted. She proved that power and love could coexist even if the world judged her harshly for it. So, what did Catherine's loves really mean? They weren't just romantic entanglements. They were partnerships. Some lovers helped her rule. Some gave her comfort in private. And some were simply moments of joy in a life filled with responsibility. Catherine was not defined by her lovers, but they were part of the story of how she survived and thrived as a woman at the very top of a ruthless political world. Picture her now, the gilded halls of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, candlelight glinting on polished floors, Catherine walking in her regal gown, every step commanding respect. Behind her, whispers swirl, some envious, some scandalized. Yet in her chambers, she sits with Potemkin, discussing the future of the empire, maybe even laughing together over a private joke. Love, in Catherine's world, wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. And as you let your mind drift on that image, remember this: Catherine's so-called scandals didn't ruin her. They couldn't. She outlasted her enemies, outshone the rumors, and left a legacy that still defines Russia today. When we hear her name, we might remember the gossip, but we also remember the greatness. In that way, Catherine's story ties beautifully into the long chain of queens and kings whose secret loves shaped history. They remind us that behind the crowns and portraits were human hearts longing, daring, sometimes reckless, but always very real. When we wander into the French royal courts of the Middle Ages, it feels less like entering a political institution and more like stepping onto a stage, a vast theater where every glance, every poem, every whispered word carried weight and meaning, where love itself was not a private feeling, but a performance, a carefully constructed ritual that shaped reputations, politics, and even the course of kingdoms. France, more than perhaps any other European land, embraced the concept of amour courtois, or courtly love, a culture where knights dedicated themselves to noble ladies, where poetry and song became the language of desire, and where the boundary between admiration and scandal was so thin it could be crossed with a single kiss. Imagine the great halls of Paris in the 13th and 14th centuries, candlelight flickering against carved stone tapestries, glowing with scenes of hunts and battles, while musicians strummed lutes and recited verses by troubadours who had traveled across Europe, bringing with them songs of longing and devotion. Kings, queens, knights, and ladies alike gathered in these spaces, their faces half hidden in shadow, their conversations laced with both flattery and danger. For French monarchs, love affairs weren't merely personal matters. They were woven into the very fabric of courtly life. Take Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, whose handsome face and commanding presence earned him admiration across Europe, but whose reign was shadowed by the notorious Tour de Nesle affair. 3 of his daughters-in-law were accused of adultery with knights, their secret meetings revealed by a chance discovery of purses they had given their lovers. The scandal exploded into trials, execution, and a storm of shame that shook the royal family, proving that in a court so obsessed with romance, private affairs could swiftly become matters of life and death. Then there was Charles VII, who reigned during the chaos of the 100 Years' War, a man whose fortunes rose and fell dramatically until the arrival of Joan of Arc changed everything. But while Joan led armies, Another woman shaped Charles's private world, Sorel, often remembered as the first officially recognized royal mistress of France. Wasn't just a beauty draped in pearls. She was a confidant, a trusted voice, and a figure who wielded influence over the king's decisions. Her open position at court marked a turning point, signaling that the role of a royal mistress could be substantial, a part of the stage play of monarchy itself, where passion, loyalty, and politics became inseparable. S. beauty was immortalized in paintings, and her death at a young age only added to her legend, leaving the court with a sense of both romance and tragedy. But was not alone in shaping this theater of love. There were countless others, men and women, who used romance as a tool, a weapon, or a shield. At the French court, the very idea of love was elevated to an art form. Troubadours and poets, like Détraz, filled halls with stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, tales of forbidden love that reflected the desires of the nobles listening in hushed awe. These were not just idle entertainments. They were mirrors held up to reality, offering models of passion and devotion that nobles sometimes followed, sometimes twisted to suit their own needs. Knights wore a lady's favor into tournaments, perhaps a ribbon, a jewel, or even just a token scrap of fabricant, risked their lives to prove their devotion. In turn, ladies inspired them with glances, words, or secret encouragements, weaving a web of romance that made every interaction at court feel charged with meaning. Yet this culture of romance was not without its dangers. A knight who pledged himself too boldly might be accused of overstepping, and a lady who entertained too much attention could be branded as loose or even treacherous. Queens and princesses walked a particularly fine line. Their marriages were political, designed to unite kingdoms or secure alliances, but their hearts, like anyone else's, could wander. And when they did, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Tour de Nesle affair had proven that. Even centuries later, whispers of queens and princesses' alleged indiscretions continued to haunt French dynasties, their reputations twisted by rumor long after their deaths. What made the French courts so intoxicating was this constant tension between love as art and love as danger. On one hand, romance was celebrated, glorified in song and story, a noble pursuit that gave meaning to life beyond the battlefield. On the other hand, real affairs threatened alliances, stirred jealousy, and sometimes ended in executions. Love was a game, but it was a game played with sharp edges, and the kings themselves were not immune. Charles V had, but many others followed his example. Francis I, the Renaissance king of France, was notorious for his charm and many affairs, his court becoming a glittering arena of seduction and intrigue. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King, centuries later, would surround himself with official mistresses, turning their presence into part of the royal spectacle. In France, love was never entirely private. It was woven into the very performance of monarchy. Picture it for a moment. The great hall at the Chateau de Blois, a feast underway, goblets of wine glinting in the light, the sound of music and laughter filling the air. At one end of the table sits the king, his eyes drifting toward a beautiful lady-in-waiting. Across the hall, a knight, emboldened by drink, composes verses in his head that he will recite by torchlight later that night. The queen sits in silence, her face composed, but her thoughts perhaps elsewhere, caught between duty and desire. Around them swirl courtiers, poets, priests, and spies, each with their own agenda, each watching, listening, waiting for some slip of passion that might change everything. This was the theater of the French royal courts, where love was both entertainment and danger, where every act of romance played out before an audience. And as we let our minds drift on this scene, we can see how the culture of courtly love gave nobles and royals alike a script to follow, but one that could never fully control the raw power of the heart. Love, whether sung in a ballad or whispered in a corridor, remained unpredictable, a force that could elevate or destroy, a reminder that beneath the crowns and costumes, even kings and queens were human. And perhaps that is why we still find their stories so captivating today. Because behind all the grandeur and ceremony, there were always hearts beating, longing, daring to love, even when the risk was ruin. When we turn our gaze southward to the courts of Spain during the later Middle Ages, we find a kingdom forged in fire and faith, a land where kings and queens were expected to embody Christian piety, where marriage was a sacred tool for uniting realms, and where personal longing often had to bow to the iron weight of duty, yet beneath the rigid surface of arranged unions and religious devotion, desire still found its way, slipping into shadows, whispered in corridors, confessed in poetry, or hidden behind veils of secrecy. And in that tension between duty and desire, the Spanish monarchs left us stories both tender and tragic. Castile and Aragon, the two great kingdoms that would eventually merge into modern Spain, were places where dynastic marriages were everything. A union could mean peace between rival houses or a stronger defense against Muslim kingdoms in the south. And so princes and princesses were bartered like chess pieces, their lives arranged long before they were old enough to know what love even meant. Yet even in such a rigid system, the human heart was restless. Take King Alfonso, the 11th of Castile. In the 14th century, he was formally married to Maria of Portugal, a union that should have solidified ties between Castile and Portugal. But Alfonso's heart belonged to someone else, Leonor de, a noblewoman of extraordinary beauty and charm. Leonor became not just his mistress, but his partner in every sense. She bore him 10 children, and Alfonso showered her with lands, titles, and influence, while poor Queen Maria languished in the background, humiliated but powerless to change her fate. When Alfonso died suddenly in 1350, Leonor's power collapsed overnight, and the queen's revenge was swift. Leonor was imprisoned and executed, a grim reminder that in Spain, love could be intoxicating but deadly once duty reasserted itself. Then there was Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the famous Catholic monarchs, remembered for uniting Spain, completing the Reconquista, and sending Christopher Columbus across the ocean, but less often remembered for their personal lives. Their marriage was unusual in that it was both a political alliance and, by all accounts, a partnership rooted in genuine affection. Chronicles suggest that Ferdinand was not always faithful. Rumors of affairs circulated, whispers of mistresses, perhaps a child born outside wedlock, but Isabella remained devoted, and together they projected an image of holy unity. For them, duty always outweighed desire, but even so, the shadows of human weakness lurked at the edges of their carefully constructed image. And then, of course, came their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, who married Henry VIII of England and became entangled in one of the most infamous love stories in history. Her dignity and piety standing in stark contrast to the turbulence of her husband's passions. In Iberian courts, the clash between Catholic ideals and personal longing created a unique kind of scandal. Love affairs weren't just dangerous politically. They were sins that could damn the soul. And so secrecy became even more crucial. The chronicles tell of Whispers princes who snuck away to meet lovers under cover of night, queens accused of inappropriate closeness with handsome courtiers, and nobles who risked both reputation and salvation for a fleeting moment of passion. One striking tale is that of King Pedro I of Castile, known as Pedro the Cruel by some and Pedro the Just by others. His great love was de Padilla, a woman he adored so much that though he married other women for political reasons, he always returned to her, and after her death, he even had their relationship recognized as a legitimate marriage, retroactively declaring her his true queen. For Pedro, desire outweighed duty, and while it brought him joy, it also fueled conflict with nobles and foreign powers who saw his behavior as reckless. Spanish courts were full of contradictions. On one hand, religion demanded chastity, fidelity, and the sanctity of marriage. But on the other, kings were men of power who often felt entitled to pursue their desires. Mistresses became fixtures in some courts, though they were never granted the same recognition or acceptance as in France. Instead, they lived in the shadows, sometimes elevated with wealth and titles, sometimes discarded when they became inconvenient. Their fates tied to the whims of powerful men who balanced passion against politics. For queens, the dangers were even greater. A whisper of infidelity could end not just their marriage, but their lives. The stakes were too high, and so most royal women lived under constant scrutiny, their every move judged by priests, courtiers, and ambassadors. Yet, despite the risks, we know that some queens and princesses did dare, leaving behind rumors in letters, in gossip recorded by ambassadors, in poems that hint at secret longings. Imagine the Alhambra in Granada after its conquest in 1492, its marble halls still echoing with the voices of Muslim rulers recently driven into exile, and now filled with the pious Catholic monarchs and their glittering court. Outwardly, everything is devotion, rosaries clutched, mass attended daily, portraits painted with solemn dignity. But behind closed doors, a young courtier lingers too long by a queen's side, or a king slips away from prayers to meet a mistress waiting in the gardens. The Spanish court was a paradox, rigid and devout in appearance, but full of human hearts beating restlessly beneath the weight of duty. And as we think about these monarchs, Alfonso and Leonor, Ferdinand and Isabella, Pedro, and we see how their secret loves shaped more than just gossip. They influenced politics, succession, and even the stability of the realm. Some affairs brought comfort, others brought ruin, but all revealed the unshakable truth that even in the most pious courts, desire could not be extinguished. And so, in Spain, love became a double-edged sword, a private comfort in lives filled with pressure, but also a dangerous temptation that could bring punishment from both the throne and the church. Perhaps that is why these stories linger, because they show us how, even in a land dominated by faith and duty, kings and queens still longed for something simple and human to love and be loved, and sometimes they risked everything for it. When we drift into the misty highlands of Scotland and the icy kingdoms of the north, we find a world of passion, betrayal, and whispered scandal that feels both rugged and romantic, where monarchs who ruled wild landscapes and fierce peoples were often just as untamed in their private lives, their loves stirring as much trouble as their battles ever did, and their stories lingering in both history and legend, like songs carried on the wind. Scotland, in particular, gave us one of the most infamous figures in the history of royal romance, Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman whose beauty, charm, and restless heart brought her both admiration and ruin. Born in 1542, Mary was crowned queen when she was only 6 days old, and from that moment, her life was shaped by politics and intrigue. Yet, when her husband died young, she returned to Scotland, a widow at 18, still radiant, still full of hope, but walking into a kingdom bristling with danger. Her first Scottish marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, began with passion but quickly soured. Darnley was handsome and charming, but he was also arrogant, violent, and untrustworthy. Their union turned poisonous, filled with jealousy and anger, and when Darnley was mysteriously murdered in 1567, his body found in a garden after an explosion destroyed, his house rumors swirled that Mary had conspired in his death. What fueled those rumors was her quick marriage to James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a man many believed was responsible for killing Darnley. Whether Mary was complicit or simply swept away by Bothwell's forceful personality, the scandal was too great to ignore. The nobles rose against her. She was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI, and she fled to England seeking refuge, only to find herself imprisoned by her cousin, Elizabeth I. For nearly 2 decades, Mary languished in captivity until her execution in 1587, her reputation forever entangled with scandalous love affairs and political missteps. Yet even in death, she became a romantic figure, a tragic queen whose heart had led her astray. In Scotland, the line between passion and treason was razor thin, and Mary's fate proved just how dangerous love could be when worn on a crown. Travel further north, across the cold seas to Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, and you find kings and queens whose love story became woven into sagas, half history and half legend tales, recited by firelight in longhouses and carved into the memory of their people. In Norway, the sagas tell us of King Harald Fair, the first king to unite the land, who vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he ruled all of Norway. A dramatic gesture made to impress a woman named Gyda, who refused to marry him unless he proved himself worthy by ruling a kingdom. Centuries later, in Denmark, King Christian II fell deeply in love with Dyveke Sigbritsdatter, a Dutch commoner who became his mistress. Their relationship scandalized the Danish court, not just because Dyveke was lowborn, but because her mother wielded influence over the king, advising him in matters of state. Nobles seethed with resentment, and when Dyveke died suddenly, many suspected she had been poisoned, her death leaving Christian devastated and politically weakened. In Sweden, King Gustavus Adolphus, remembered as a brilliant military leader, also found himself entangled in rumors of affairs, though the most dramatic Scandinavian story belongs perhaps to his daughter, Queen Christina of Sweden, the eccentric and brilliant queen who famously abdicated her throne in 1654. Christina was rumored to have close. Though she lived after the medieval period, her life reflects the long tradition of northern rulers whose loves and scandals captured imaginations. In the Viking sagas, too, we hear echoes of royal passion, stories of kings who took mistresses, of queens accused of betrayal, of marriages forged for alliances but torn apart by desire. These tales though embroidered with myth, reveal a truth as old as time, that in the cold halls of the North, beneath furs and crowns, hearts still beat with longing, often leading their owners into danger. Picture for a moment the windswept castles of Scotland, their gray stone walls rising above. Misty locks, torches flickering as courtiers whisper of their queen's latest choices, or the longhouses of Norway, filled with smoke and laughter as bards recite the deeds of kings who fought and loved in equal measure. In these lands, love was no less powerful than swords, and often just as deadly. Mary, Queen of Scots, became a symbol of how passion could destroy a throne. While in the Nordic kingdoms, kings and queens found their reputations forever shaped by whom they chose to love. And as you let these stories settle in your mind, there is a reminder here, too. Whether in the wild highlands or the frozen north, whether queen or king, noble or commoner, love is always a force of risk and wonder, capable of lifting rulers to greatness or casting them into ruin, leaving behind sagas that echo long after the lovers themselves are gone. There is something both thrilling and terrifying about the moment when a private love affair steps out of the shadows and becomes something more, something dangerous, something that threatens not just reputations, but crowns and kingdoms. Because in the world of medieval royalty, love was never truly private, was always tied to alliances, dynasties, and politics. And when kings or queens allowed their hearts to guide them instead of their duties, the result could look a lot like treason, with secret meetings by candlelight giving way to uprisings, plots, and betrayals that changed the course of history. Take Isabella of France, the she-wolf we met earlier, whose affair with Roger Mortimer was more than just passionate, was rebellion wrapped in romance. Together they plotted against her husband, Edward II, and their alliance became the backbone of a coup that toppled the king himself, proving that sometimes love could be the sharpest weapon of all. Or think of Mary, Queen of Scots, who, after the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley, married the Earl of Bothwell, a move that outraged her nobles and sparked accusations of conspiracy, leading directly to her downfall. In both cases, the line between private passion and public treachery vanished, because to love the wrong person at the wrong time was to betray the crown. But these were not isolated tales. Across Europe, love affairs were treated with suspicion, because if a queen loved a man who wasn't her king, it raised questions about succession. Who was the true father of a royal child? And if a king loved a mistress too openly, it weakened alliances and enraged noble families who felt sidelined. In France, the Tour de Nesle affair in the early 1300s showed how scandal could quickly turn into treason. The daughters-in-law of Philip IV were accused of carrying on secret romances with knights. And once their liaisons were discovered, the knights were tortured and executed, while the women were imprisoned for life. The affair didn't just stain reputations, it cast doubt on the legitimacy of royal heirs and destabilized the monarchy. In Castile, Leonor de, the beloved mistress of King Alfonso XI, became so influential that after the king's death, she was seen as a political threat. Queen Maria of Portugal had her executed, treating her not as a romantic rival, but as a traitor to the rightful queen. And in England, Henry VIII's passions created ripple effects that looked suspiciously like treason trials. Anne Boleyn, accused of adultery and even incest, faced charges that were likely exaggerated. But the accusation of betrayal was enough to bring her to the scaffold. In these courts, Love was never just about two people, it was about power. And when that power shifted in ways the crown couldn't control, it became treason. Imagine the tension, a queen stealing glances at a courtier across a crowded hall, knowing that a single misstep could see her accused of plotting against her husband, or a king elevating a mistress so high that nobles whisper she controls him, and suddenly those whispers turn into accusations of conspiracy. To love was to gamble, and the stakes were everything. Even the language of the time shows us how dangerous romance could be. Chronicles are full of words like betrayal, rebellion, and conspiracy tied directly to affairs, as if the act of giving one's heart to the wrong person was no different from handing over a kingdom. And yet, people still dared, because how could they not? For all the risks, love remained irresistible, a force greater than fear. And so kings and queens continued to risk their crowns for a touch, a smile, a secret letter hidden in a sleeve. In this way, treason born of love was both tragic and deeply human. It reminds us that behind the formal portraits and rigid ceremonies, these rulers were still flesh and blood, still vulnerable to longing, still willing to risk everything for a forbidden embrace. Picture the Tower of London, its cold stone walls echoing with the footsteps of guards, while inside a queen waits for trial, accused not just of loving wrongly, but of betraying her king. Her eyes closed as she remembers the warmth of the moments that led her here. Or a knight dragged to execution, his only crime being that he loved a princess too openly, his devotion rebranded as treachery. These images show us how quickly the warmth of passion could turn to the chill of doom in royal courts. And perhaps that is why these stories haunt us so much, because they reveal the fragility of human desire when entangled with the machinery of power. Love, when treated as treason, became one of the most dangerous forces in history, toppling monarchs, shifting alliances, and leaving behind legacies that blurred the line between romance and rebellion. So, as you let your mind drift on these tales, remember that four kings and queens falling in love was never a simple act. It was a gamble with their thrones, a wager with their lives, and sometimes the most beautiful feeling in the world became the deadliest crime of all. When we reach this chapter, it is almost as though we are stepping into a twilight zone between fact and fiction, because so many of the supposed love affairs of medieval kings and queens exist in a hazy space where rumor, gossip, political propaganda, and outright invention blur together, leaving us unsure whether we are hearing a true confession of the heart or simply a story whispered by enemies to stain reputations. Medieval chroniclers, after all, were not neutral reporters. They were often monks with moral agendas, courtiers hoping to flatter or undermine, or foreign observers eager to spread scandal about rival kingdoms. This means that what we know or think we know about secret affairs may actually be less history and more legend, carefully constructed to make someone look sinful, foolish, or unfit to rule. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, who we discussed earlier. The stories of her affairs with troubadours or knights are tantalizing, but they may be more poetry than reality. Inspired by the romantic culture of courtly love in southern France rather than her actual life, Eleanor was powerful, clever, and politically active, and it was often easier for chroniclers to explain a strong woman as influence by claiming she must have been led by passion rather than her own intellect. The same is true of Isabella of France, whose relationship with Roger Mortimer may indeed have been real, but the more salacious details, secret trysts in castles. Coded letters hidden in sleeves were almost certainly embellished, designed to make her look like a scheming temptress rather than a political strategist. And then there is Catherine the Great, who, though outside the strict medieval timeline, became one of the most myth-shrouded monarchs in history. Enemies spread stories that exaggerated her supposed lovers and even created grotesque rumors about her private life. Rumors so outrageous they overshadowed her actual achievements as a ruler. In this sense, many scandals of royal love are less about what really happened and more about what people wanted to believe, or what they wanted others to believe. In France, the Tour de Nesle affair we mentioned earlier became a moral tale told again and again, each retelling darker than the last, until it was less a historical event and more a warning story about lust and betrayal. Similarly, in Scotland, tales of Mary, Queen of Scots, were twisted and retold until her image was split in two. On one hand, a tragic, romantic heroine undone by her heart, and on the other, a reckless seductress who schemed her way into ruin. In the Norse sagas, too, we find kings and queens caught up in love stories that may be more legend than truth, the storytellers weaving passion into the same fabric as battles and gods, until it is impossible to separate what was whispered in the royal hall from what was dreamed up around a fire centuries later. Why did these exaggerations take root? Because love was the easiest way to explain the inexplicable. If a king made a foolish political choice, people could say, "Ah, he must have been blinded by a mistress." If a queen showed unusual ambition or influence, they could claim she must be in love with someone secretly pulling the strings. In a world where rulers were supposed to be almost superhuman, above ordinary weakness, the idea that they were undone by love made them both more human and more scandalous, and nothing spread faster in medieval courts than scandal. Of course, some of these legends have a grain of truth at their center, but over the centuries, the stories grew like vines, tangled and wild, until the truth was lost beneath layers of exaggeration. Think of Edward II and Piers Gaveston. The closeness of their bond was real, but later writers, both sympathetic and hostile, magnified it into something larger than life, turning Edward into a symbol of indulgence and favoritism, when in reality, the political conflict surrounding Gaveston was far more complex. Or Henry VIII, whose actual affairs were certainly numerous, but the gossip inflated them into a catalogue of conquests, some of which are impossible to prove. The fascinating thing is that many of these myths survive longer and stronger than the facts themselves. We remember Eleanor of Aquitaine as the fiery queen, rumored to have lovers Isabella as the treacherous she-wolf Catherine the Great as the endlessly scandalous empress, because the human imagination clings to drama, to romance, to the idea that even the mightiest rulers could be toppled by a kiss in the dark. And maybe that is why these legends endure, because they remind us that no matter how many armies or castles a monarch controlled, the heart was still vulnerable, and vulnerability makes for the best stories. As you lie here listening, you might find yourself wondering which of these tales were real and which were mere whispers, blown across centuries, and in truth, you may never know, because history itself is a blend of fact and story, carefully shaped by those who wrote it down. What matters is the way these myths still capture our imaginations centuries later, allowing us to glimpse kings and queens, not just as rulers, but as people, flawed and yearning their reputations, sculpted as much by gossip as by truth. And so, as the legends drift like smoke around us, we can let them lull us into that half-dreaming state where fact and fiction mingle, and where even the wildest rumors can feel like possibilities, reminding us that in the end, history is not only about what happened, but also about the stories people chose to tell. When we finally arrive at the end of this long journey through castles and courts, through whispered romances and scandalous betrayals, it feels only right to pause and reflect on what all of these stories really mean, not just for the kings and queens who lived them, but for us as listeners, centuries later, lying here in the quiet, letting history turn into a kind of lullaby. Because if there is one lesson that echoes through the medieval halls we have wandered, it is that love in royal courts was never just love. It was power, it was risk, it was secrecy, and it was often a dangerous game with rules that could shift overnight. For kings and queens, marriage was rarely about passion. It was about alliances, treaties, and heirs, about weaving webs of politics that stretched across kingdoms, and so when they sought affection, they often found it outside their formal unions, in secret meetings, stolen letters, or quiet walks in gardens where eyes could not follow. These affairs, whether real or only imagined by gossip, were dangerous because they brought humanity into a system that demanded calculation. A king who loved too openly could alienate noble families, tilt alliances, or weaken his reputation as a steady ruler. A queen who dared to love could be accused not only of adultery, but of treason, because her heart was tied to the legitimacy of heirs and the security of dynasties. And yet, knowing the stakes, they still risked it. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, Edward II, Henry VIII, Mary Queen of Scots, Catherine the Great, whether they were truly swept away by passion or whether history exaggerated their desires, their stories remind us that no crown was heavy enough to silence the heartbeat beneath it. But what is also striking is how often these stories were shaped not by the lovers themselves, but by the chroniclers who recorded them. In an age without social media, gossip spread in poems, chronicles, and sermons, and enemies used the language of love as a weapon. To accuse a queen of a secret affair was to weaken her power. To say a king was ruled by a mistress was to cast doubt on his judgment. These narratives, embroidered with exaggeration, became legends, and those legends often outlived the truth. It is why Eleanor shines in our memory as the bold, independent queen who might have loved too freely, why Isabella is remembered as the She-Wolf, whose passion toppled a king, why Mary is painted as both tragic heroine and reckless lover. The truth may have been more ordinary, more complex, less dramatic, but the stories of their loves became the stories of their lives. And maybe that is the point. Maybe what survives is not the reality, but the reflection of what people needed to believe that even the most powerful rulers were still human, still capable of longing, jealousy, betrayal, and tenderness. There is a kind of comfort in that, knowing that behind the jeweled crowns and flowing robes, behind the guarded walls of castles, kings and queens were still like us, reaching for connection, sometimes making terrible choices, sometimes following their hearts when they should have followed reason. And when we think about the secrecy of these loves, we can almost feel the thrill of it. The hidden letters tucked under cushion, the glances exchanged across crowded halls, the risk of discovery turning every moment into fire. That secrecy was part of the allure, part of why these stories survive. Because forbidden love always feels more intense, more memorable, more worth telling. Yet, secrecy also turned love into a weapon, because once revealed, it could be twisted into treason, used as a reason for exile, imprisonment, or execution. Love was both sanctuary and snare, freedom and trap. And so, as we reflect on it now, in the calm of the present, it becomes clear that these stories are not just about the past. They are about the timeless tension between love and power, between desire and duty, between the private heart and the public role. They remind us that every human, no matter how exalted, must walk that line, and that the higher the throne, the sharper the edge. Think of it, a queen gazing out of a tower window, dreaming of a man she can never truly have, knowing that if anyone discovers her secret, it could cost her everything. A king pacing through his chambers, torn between the woman he loves and the alliance his marriage demands. A mistress who holds a monarch's heart, but not his crown, caught between influence and vulnerability. These images are timeless, and they resonate because we can feel them. Still, we know what it means to love in secret, to long for what we cannot have, to risk more than we should for a fleeting touch. That is why, centuries later, we still tell these stories, not just to learn facts about the past, but to feel that strange kinship across time. And now, as this chapter draws to its close, let the reflection settle gently. Love in the medieval court was never simple, never safe, but always deeply human. It made kings fools, made queens daring, made courts whisper, and made history bend in unexpected directions. It gave us sagas, legends, and myths that we still repeat in the quiet hours of night, because they speak to something eternal the way love can move. Mountains topple thrones, and yet, at the same time, simply remind us that even the greatest among us crave tenderness. So, as you close your eyes and let the stories fade into the soft silence around you, carry this thought with you into sleep, that behind every crown was a heart fragile and fierce, that beat just like ours, longing for love. Even when it was forbidden, even when it was dangerous, even when it could destroy everything. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth of all, that no matter how much power a person holds, the need for love is the one power that rules us all.